Well, yeah, the podcast, since Brian last pulled the plug on my show.
I don't know what's going on, so you're...
Yeah. I mean, I relaunched it. And
Brian Last, is that the guy with Jim Cornette?
Yeah.
Yes.
Who is this guy? Where did he come from? No, I'm serious. I'm not...
Jersey, he was a big wrestling fan growing up.
Right.
Family had a lot of dough, and he made friends with Cornette, and he started several podcasts with Arcadian Vanguard. So he's a self-proclaimed wrestling historian, and I had a 2-year run with him, and we did over 500,000 downloads, and then because I was talking to Conrad, he basically pulled the plug on my show.
Oh,
are we with this?
Yeah, I'm not going to
this guy. If you're friends with this guy, you can't be friends with us.
Yeah, because it had nothing to do with the podcast. He just,
I had that problem in MLW. Like Cornette was mad at Madden. I don't know about what.
Yeah.
Okay, and he refused to do anything if we would speak to Madden.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of the situation I was in.
Yeah.
Wait, who are you not allowed to talk to?
Me, Conrad Thompson.
Yeah. So who's upset with Conrad?
Brian Last.
What were you doing while he was talking?
Brian Last is upset with Conrad. Well, so
yeah,
Konnan
he just never liked Conrad. I don't know what the deal is. He never really explained it. Conrad never met the guy.
Right.
He just said
that's even more beautiful. You never even met the guy, and he don't like you.
Right? Because he said
Brian Last is a fascinating story too, because he Cornette, and then they hate Russo, right? But years and years and years ago, when he was a kid, Brian Last booked Vince.
At the bar
mitzvah. Who else? Somebody for his bar mitzvah.
Big Vito.
Yeah,
like Vic Venom.
Crush.
Big Vito and Vic Venom.
Yeah.
When Vince was doing his Vic Venom radio thing, Brian Last his parents paid to have them his bar mitzvah.
I know. I know.
And then it went downhill all from there, I guess.
And I've heard on Conrad's shows he addressed it once and was like, I like his work. I don't have a problem with Brian. I don't know what his problem was with me, basically. So Conrad's in the dark.
There's a lot of that in wrestling, John, which is so petty and stupid and immature. If you like this guy, we can't be friends.
Right.
Or if you talk to this guy, don't talk to me.
Right.
It's like, really, are you that shallow and petty and unevolved? What the is going on here?
Yeah.
A lot of that going on. Right?
I know.
As you're the recipient.
Are we taping right now or no? Are we?
I think we are.
Yes.
Yeah. Are we?
Yeah.
So we're already into the segment. Is that what's going on?
Yeah. Okay. So let us know what's going on with your new podcast. You're no longer working with Brian Last. Who are you working with? Is it the same subject matter? Are you flipping it up a little bit? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now podcast started with Brian Last and the Arcadian Vanguard Network back in May of 1919 when I really had just gotten in, and it was a cool way to go back 30 years and review the shows that we did all those years ago, and we had a really good show. People loved it.
So what was it, like interviews from the 70s that you would play on the show?
So basically we would review the show that I did 30 years ago. So each and every week it was episodic because I did shows from 1989 to 1995, saved every one of them. So every week we'd go back and review a show from 30 years ago. And
did you find a lot of your old fans found you? And
absolutely.
And you were able to reunite and reconnect? That must have been super
so
cool.
Many. There's so many out there, and it was kind of crazy. And then Conrad Thompson and I started having some discussions, and I met him in 2019. I really admired what he did with StarCast and the network that he built, and so we had some conversations about doing some things together. And I told Brian about that, being transparent, and Brian told me back then, even a couple of years ago, I really don't like him. I don't really think that any of my talent should do anything with anybody else. I don't like sharing talent, and so I kind of let it go. And my conversations with Conrad started heating up again in the summer. And I told Brian once again, and then he was like,
I'm going to make a point here. Sorry to interrupt you. That's a very bizarre position to take. Like my talent. Like, bro, this is like since when is this like a a sole proprietorship or something? Bro, you guys, the podcasters are like the classic independent contractors.
Right.
All we're doing is turning on a freaking computer and pressing you record and stuff. If I pay you, nobody else can pay you to do this. It's ridiculous.
Well, it was a labor of love. I wasn't really making money from it. We did Patreon. Had a Patreon account, and I brought one sponsor in that we split revenue on. But I was never, he never had a contract with me, and he didn't want to sign one. He said it was a handshake deal, and I was okay with that. But then in the summer, things started heating up a little bit with Conrad. We're talking about doing some things that had nothing to do with Pro Wrestling Spotlight. And Brian, I told him, and he's like, I'm not comfortable with this. And he gave me a deadline. And when I had a conversation, I said, nothing's imminent with Conrad, but I don't want to stop discussions with him. And he pulled the plug on the show. And I appreciate, and I still to this day, him giving me the opportunity to rebuild this audience and following. But I was kind of like, it was done. And then I was, all right, now what's next? It took me a while to put together a team, and I relaunched John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight. We're on episode, actually tonight we're dropping the steroid episode directly after Dark Side of the Ring.
Who's your team?
Apropos.
Yeah, I mean, I have a 3-hour episode because I broke the story of the Zaharian trial. I broke it with Meltzer.
You were on the
air.
Phil Donahue show, weren't you? Or maybe?
Yeah, I'm on Dark Side tonight as well.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever this podcast airs, it'll probably be aired by now. But right now, I have before I got on this conversation with you, I was uploading some content for a show that'll air in a few weeks, and it was Nature Boy Buddy Rogers' last interview before he passed away. So I still have all of that fabulous content, and every week I have a new co-host, a guy that I've known for 30 years, another wrestling historian. His name is Bob Smith. He was Bob Smith. He was the managing editor for PWI, the Wrestler Inside Wrestling. He was the guy that wrote the PWI Top 500.
What years
ago.
there? Do you remember?
In the 90s. In the 90s. Okay. And so he's co-hosting with me. And basically what the show is now, it's really more reminiscent of what I did 30 years ago. It really is like the Pro Wrestling Spotlight from years ago because I'm bringing guests on, which Brian and I never did. And now I am able to air a podcast that was actually 30 years to the week of the original Pro Wrestling Spotlight. So it's going to be really timely. And I'm bringing Don Liable back to do a time capsule each week. And we really just released the first episode, which covered Weekend of Champions of 1991 this past Monday through the Megaphone platform, and it's out everywhere. And we got a tremendous amount of support in the first week. And with tonight's episode on the steroid scandals, there's an incredible audio on there from me breaking the story to going to Harrisburg to cover the Zaharian trial, then going to a press conference Vince McMahon had and confronting him about them not inviting wrestling media to the press conference. So it's really some really very...
So let me ask you a question. You confronted Vince yourself and told him, why didn't you invite wrestling media?
Well, yeah, because at that press conference, which took place in July of 1995, and when I called up the offices to find out, because I heard about the press conference, a steroid policy was being announced, I called up and they told me there was no press conference. Their PR director at the time, Steve Planamenta, and I had to sneak in under an assumed name that was a news director, a program director, rather, of the radio station I was broadcasting on. So I got in there and I started, hard-hitting questions about what was going on, and the mainstream media really wasn't covering it. And then after the press conference, I just went up to him with all the reporters around, and I was like, Vince, how come you didn't invite the wrestling media here? He started to answer. The PR guy says, none of them called. I was like, well, I know I called, and I know others called who didn't have access to this. And it was really a very tense conversation that people listening to my podcast will be able to hear for the first time in 30 years. So now each show is going to be episodic. We're catching people up. So by Thanksgiving weekend, the Thanksgiving weekend show will cover the Pro Wrestling Spotlight from Thanksgiving weekend 30 years ago with guests Kevin Sullivan, Nature Boys Buddy Landell and Buddy Rogers, Joel Goodhart. And so each week after that, we're just going to be in chronological order. And we have so much history to cover because I'm in the Vince Russo era now. It's like we're just becoming partners. We're moving the show as of January of 92 into WEVD in New York City. That's when the sex scandals break. And then that whole breakup with Vince Russo is documented, and that'll be aired. And then everything else, including, once we get to 1993, my introduction to you by Dave Meltzer, and that's when we put together the deal for AAA to come to the United States. So all of that is documented, every one of those shows. So when we come to that time period, I'll be calling you up and saying, hey, listen, why don't you come on the show so we can talk about what happened 30 years ago? So it's really I'll
make
cool.
sure to be fashionably late.
That's okay. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out on your schedule. And I'm bringing guests on. So, like, for example, the steroid episode show. Tonight I have Evan Husney on with me, who discusses Dark Side of the Rings episode. And so I think it's going to be history. It's going to be guests that were on 30 years ago, the ones that are still with us. And it's going to be a real look back at what was going on in wrestling. And we have 3 years of shows to go, which is kind of cool.